Hey everyone, Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros, bringing you 10 players to cut in Week 7. I love talking about players to add on waivers, but we cannot overlook the stress of trying to figure out who to cut in their place. And I respect all league sizes, so we'll start things off by talking about 12 to 14 team leagues, and then we will dive into more shallow leagues. First up, Nelson Agholor. After 6 weeks, I would say that we have enough sample size to understand the receiving options in New England. Jakobi Meyers is the receiver for fantasy managers to roster, leading the team with 52 targets. Hunter Henry is the red zone threat. He has 28 targets and 3 of the team's 7 receiving touchdowns. Kendrick Bourne is the big play receiver with the high ceiling and the low floor. He's the guy that you want to play in those favorable fantasy matchups. And after that, it's a bunch of players with no consistency. So let's break down the numbers with Nelson Agholor. He is second on the team with 30 targets, but 18 of those targets came in the first 3 weeks of the season. Meyers has broken out in recent weeks, and Bourne has become the deep threat. Agholor has 12 targets, 7 receptions, 114 yards, no touchdowns, and 15.4 fantasy points over the last 3 games. He is the 74th ranked wide receiver for those 3 weeks. There has been hope that Agholor would emerge as a deep threat in the offense, similar to his role that he had in Las Vegas, where he averaged 18.7 yards per reception, but it's just not happening, and it's time to cut him loose. Next up, Josh Gordon. If you were rostering Josh Gordon with the hopes of a return to greatness, you gotta let go now. Let's even ignore his very minimal usage in the past 2 games with Kansas City and just break down the production that he's had in recent years. Gordon has not scored a touchdown in the last 12 games he's played in. The last touchdown he scored was in Week 1 of 2019. His last 100-yard game was in Week 8 of the 2018 season. He has recorded 4 100-yard games and caught 6 touchdowns since his breakout season in 2013. Yes, since 2013. He is now a 30-year-old receiver that has played in 20 snaps in his last 2 games and seen 1 target for 11 yards. Yet he's rostered in 28.3% of ESPN.com leagues. I'm just not seeing the fantasy appeal here based on 1 good season back in 2013. Josh Gordon is a great comeback story that needs to be on waivers instead of fantasy rosters. Cut him loose. Next up, Jalen Reagor. Last week, Jalen Reagor had 3 targets and no receptions against a Tampa Bay defense that has been decimated by injuries in the secondary. Reagor is still rostered in 45% of ESPN.com fantasy leagues, which makes no sense when you consider that he has not scored a touchdown since Week 1 and has topped 25 receiving yards only 1 time since Week 2. I don't think we need to break it down any further here. He just needs to be off all fantasy rosters at this point. Next up, SAMMY Watkins. Full disclosure, I am a Clemson grad, so if even I can come to terms with SAMMY Watkins being someone we can cut now, it's safe to say it's time to let him go. Watkins has not found the end zone yet this season and has failed to top 50 receiving yards in 3 of his last 4 games. He was seeing a decent amount of targets that made you flirt with keeping him around throughout the early portion of the season, but Marquise Brown emerged as the go-to wide receiver, and Mark Andrews has also been heavily involved in the passing game. Those 2 have combined for 8 of the 9 passing touchdowns scored by the Ravens this year. Throw in a hamstring injury that caused Watkins to miss Week 6, Rashad Bateman coming off IR, and the Ravens having a bye week in Week 8, and his opportunity window is closed. Watkins is going to have more value to the Ravens as a veteran wide receiver than he is for fantasy managers looking to actually win fantasy games. Next up, Ty'Son Williams. I know this one is going to hurt because he was an early waiver wire darling and looked so promising, but Ty'Son Williams just does not have a role in the Ravens' backfield anymore. Let's break down the last 3 weeks. He was inactive in Week 4, he had 4 carries for 6 yards in Week 5, and he was yet again active in Week 6. It makes no sense to roster a player that is literally a coin flip to be active and will not see more than 5 carries if he is active. Williams just hasn't earned the trust of the Ravens coaching staff, and it's time to let go. Next up, Ronald Jones. I know this is another painful one for fantasy managers because he is still rostered in 40.2% of ESPN.com leagues, but let's take a second to break this one down. He is the 65th ranked running back with 20.6 fantasy points in 6 games. For comparison and a reality check on how poor that production is, Trey Sermon has 20.8 fantasy points on the season despite being inactive for 1 game, having a bye week, and having 2 of those games where he only saw 1 carry. There's just no reason for Jones to be on a fantasy roster. Leonard Fournette is the Tampa Bay starting running back, and Jones sees no involvement in the pass game and only has a handful of carries per game. The time has come to let him go, and probably actually came a little while ago. Next up, Justin Fields. We're going to do a little comparison here with Justin Fields because I think we get blinded by the recent memory of greatness that we've seen from rookies in their last year in college. Justin Fields is rostered in 27.4% of ESPN.com leagues. He has averaged 8.82 fantasy points in his 4 starts this year. Yes, I repeat, 8.82 fantasy points. For comparison, Taysom Hill is rostered in 1.4% of ESPN.com leagues because he's not the starter in New Orleans, and it just wouldn't make sense to start a gadget player as your fantasy quarterback. However, had you started Taysom over Justin Fields in the 3 games that Taysom has played since Justin Fields became the starter, Taysom would have given you 9.2 fantasy points in week 3, 16.8 fantasy points in week 4, and 1.6 fantasy points in week 5. Fields would have given you 3.9 fantasy points in week 3, 8.3 fantasy points in week 4, and 8.8 fantasy points in week 5. He outproduced Taysom 1 time. You just can't roster a fantasy quarterback that is as reliable as a gadget quarterback that doesn't start. Fields played his best game of the season against a Green Bay team that has had a lot of injuries in their secondary and still only managed 14.3 fantasy points in week 6. He has games at Tampa Bay, San Francisco, and Pittsburgh before his bye week in week 10, so things just aren't likely to improve for him anytime soon. We need to let him go. Now let's move on to cut candidates in shallow leagues. First up, Trevor Lawrence. In deeper leagues, Trevor Lawrence may continue to progress and be worth playing later in the year. In a shallow league, however, I think this is a question that fantasy managers need to ask themselves. Miami has been mostly terrible on defense this year. They were without their 2 starting cornerbacks this week. That is a game that Trevor Lawrence should have dominated in fantasy, and yet he finished the game with 15.86 fantasy points and was the 16th ranked fantasy quarterback. If you can't trust him to be more productive against a team that Tom Brady shredded for 37.74 fantasy points the week before, how are you going to hang on to him in shallow leagues? I would rather stream matchups than hold on to Lawrence and waste a roster spot. Next up, Allen Robinson. Now this one is going to be rough, and we're going to have to talk it through, but it is time to consider parting ways with Allen Robinson. It's painful for fantasy managers to even think about cutting someone with Robinson's talent, but let's break a few things down. Robinson has played 6 games this year and has tallied 39.9 fantasy points or 6.7 fantasy points per game. Ouch. That makes him the 58th ranked receiver by total points scored. This is with both Andy Dalton and Justin Fields. Robinson has topped 40 receiving yards only twice this year, with his season high being 63 yards. He has found the end zone only 1 time. Quite frankly, it is bleak. It becomes a problem trading a player like Robinson when the waiver possibilities are outproducing with more fantasy points. T.Y. Hilton is rostered in just 23.7% of ESPN.com leagues, and he had 10 fantasy points in his season debut. Tim Patrick is rostered in only 40.7% of leagues, and he is averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game this season. It makes no sense to trade for Robinson when there are just better options on the waiver wire. Now, you should definitely try to sell him low in a trade before waiving him, but I feel like if he's on your roster, you have either traded for him already and are having buyer's remorse, or you have tried to trade him and just not been successful. You could keep him on your bench and you could hope for a T.Y. Hilton situation from 2020, But in shallow leagues, the answer just might be to cut your losses and move on at this point. Each week, Robinson has a poor game. It just makes it harder to justify having him on your roster. And finally, Robert Tonyan. There was a point in the season last year where Robert Tonyan went 5 games without finding the end zone, and he had 24.4 fantasy points from week 6 to week 10, and then he went on to score a touchdown in 5 straight games and 6 of his last 7 games to finish the season as the 3rd-ranked fantasy tight end. Now, it's a long year, and he could start finding the end zone, but so far, he has had a total of 20.7 fantasy points through 6 games. He is the 35th ranked fantasy tight end. I think managers in shallow leagues can just do better. Surely you've got someone on waivers with more upside, or you've probably moved on already with someone like Dalton Schultz or Hunter Henry, and you might just be holding on for hope or nostalgia, but it's time to let him go. And that wraps up Players to Cut for Week 7. I know it's tough, but it's for the best. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to Fantasy Pros across all platforms, and be sure to come back next week for another round of Players to Cut.